All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Frank Sweet. I'm AECOM's leader for the environment and energy business globally. I'm based here in Boston, Massachusetts. This call is being recorded. All lines are muted. We will have Q&A after the panel discussion. Just type your questions into the chat. I will do my best to moderate those and bring those up into the Q&A session at the end. When we go to, well, actually, let me just give us a quick safety moment. This will be on situational awareness. So my panelists have heard this before. I've tried to trim it down. So last week I was taking a flight from Dallas back to home in Boston, and the flight was delayed due to mechanical issues. The pilot came on after a bit and explained that they're having trouble with the fuel pumps. There's two fuel pumps for the central fuel tank, which pumps fuel to the wing tanks. And he asked us to, encouraged us to stay on board the plane, but gave us the option of getting off the plane. He said it'd be a pretty quick fix, that their workaround was to simply pump fuel, have the ground crew pump fuel from the central tank to the wing tanks, and the wing tanks would hold enough fuel to get us halfway back to Boston, and we'd stop in Detroit to refuel. To me, that just sounded like a bad idea. So I hit the stewardess light and asked if I could get off the plane. They said I could. I booked another flight home. As soon as we got to Boston, I checked on the original flight that I'd been on, and in fact, it had been canceled. They'd postponed it throughout the day and then finally cancel it. So someone a little higher up the chain of command at the airline had decided that flying passengers with a failed fuel pump was a bad idea. So the point there is situational awareness is not just about being aware of your surroundings when you're walking on a dark street or a dark parking lot, but it's also listening to the content of what is being said. I think I was only one of a handful of people who got off the plane, and I'm probably pretty certain most of the folks did not get where they wanted to go that day or that evening. When we move on, Brianna. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. Adrian Del Maestro is based in London. He's our Global Energy Advisory Lead. He just joined us in September. Great to have him on board. He's bringing great insights into our practice and helping us advise our clients. Jennifer Obertino is our energy practice leader. She's based in St. Louis, new in her role as well, effective October 1st. And Robert Spencer is our Global ESG Advisory Lead, and he's based in Madrid. So we've got a well-balanced international panel here for you today with some very good perspectives. Just by way of introduction, our topic today is on energy transition. To me, I tend to oversimplify things. I've always been an environmental consultant. I try to boil complex things down to the simple. To me, we've learned a lot in the last 18 months or 2 years. A lot has changed. At least I look at energy transition as a balance between fossil fuels and renewable energy sources, energy storage. It's big, complex, intertwined evolution we're going through. In fact, I speak of it in that terms. It's not so much an energy transition, but an energy revolution. And I think historians will look back on this time and characterize it like the Industrial Revolution and the technology revolution. I think, to me, the thing that's really changed in my way of thinking about this is that 2 or 3 years ago, this was all about climate change. I think government policy has done a lot to bring down the cost of renewable energy, and we now see that renewable energy, in fact, costs less than fossil fuel. And now I think what we're seeing is that private investment is really driving the transition. There is money to be made in the energy transition and with renewable energy. And you see that investment in capital flows around the world. This year, CapEx into energy transition will eclipse $1 billion and will marginally exceed the level of investment going into fossil fuels for the first time ever. So I think that's really, really significant. Anyways, why don't we get right to the panel discussion? Next slide. Oh, I guess we're leaving this one up. That's right. So I'm going to start with Robert. Robert, we've got COP28 coming up in just a couple of weeks. What do you anticipate seeing at COP28 this year?
Well, thanks, Frank. And I think it's going to be a really interesting COP this round. Certainly, what we're seeing is very high attendance. So there'll certainly be a lot of people there. And I think what we've also seen is that this is very much seen as the COP where business and trade comes to the fore. And in particular, there's a whole day devoted to trade this time, which we haven't seen before. So that's a new thing. In terms of some of the specific expectations that people might be wondering about, we will likely see that stronger commitment to phasing out fuels. Again, the fossil fuels, that is. The precise wording of that will be open to debate, and that will be one of the negotiated outcomes. I think we'll see more of those commitments around meeting that $100 billion a year financial commitment to countries that are developing and adapting to mitigate climate change. So very much in the emerging economy space. That actually was hit last year, and I think my latest understanding is that it's on its way to being hit for 2023 as well. So that's going reasonably well. At COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, last year, there was a breakthrough on loss and damage, which is the mechanism to provide financial compensation to developing countries that have suffered loss and damage from more advanced economies that have contributed for a longer time to greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. So although there was a breakthrough on that in terms of it was on the agenda and everyone looked at it, we're expecting that COP28 itself in Dubai will be the time where that actually gets an agreement. We also think in passing that we'll get that accelerated phase out of coal that didn't quite happen at COP27. So that's expected there as well. So that's some of the headlines, Frank, coming through that we can expect to see. There's lots more nuance in the detail, of course, that we could go to later and perhaps during the Q&A.
Sounds good. Thanks, Robert. And when we go to Jennifer, Jennifer, what's your perspective on the energy transition in the U.S.?
Thank you, Frank. As you said, it is a revolution. It's a journey. And the focus on energy transition is really on the affordable, accessible, and secure energy. Energy generation, as we've talked about and Robert has discussed also, is really shifting from coal, natural gas, petroleum to electricity, which is driven by the adoption of electric and alternate fuel vehicles, building electrification, and in the industrial process of electrification and utilizing alternative fuels. We're seeing the energy market, as you indicated, really growing, in some sectors of that almost 10% year over year, with an anticipated $550 billion annual investment over the next 5 years. So each year, $550 billion. Of that, we're seeing grid modernization or investment into grid infrastructure at about $100 billion a year, hydrogen at about $160 billion, and then the combination of solar and offshore wind at about another $200 billion. I do want to touch just briefly on the hydrogen market because we are seeing that the hydrogen market is, one of the fastest growing sectors, and especially because of government investment and the announcement of the DOE Hydrogen Hub grant, which was the amount of about $7 billion. And what that Hydrogen Hub grant or the Hydrogen Hubs do is they are really to build that clean hydrogen network to decarbonizing all sectors of the economy, and including the production, processing, delivery, storage, and then the end use. So as we're seeing these hubs being invested in, we're also then seeing the investment and the clustering of offshore wind, so that it is a production of green hydrogen, and then the investment into the grid infrastructure. So it is a very exciting market to be in. We are seeing some ebbs and flows, and it is being impacted by inflation, supply chain, and we're seeing some of the private investors slowing down some of their investment and refocusing their investment on their internal processes and their internal production before really taking it out and taking it to the public, because technology is still developing and they're still developing that market base. So we have to be patient and continue to focus and understanding that it'll ebb and flow, but the demand is there, and it's driven by again the government policies, and then the investment, as you had indicated too, by private industry.
I think that's an excellent point, Jennifer, and certainly in the politically charged environment we've got in the United States right now, any headline that comes up that talks about a pullback on renewable energy or any sort like that seems to get immediate and outsized attention, and the backstory on the other things that are occurring seems to get lost. There was an interesting article just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal on Exxon's investment in lithium extraction and battery production. It was a small article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, fuller discussion in the business section, but that it didn't get a lot of attention. But that's a pretty significant move by one of the biggest oil energy companies in the world.
Yes.
All right, Adrian. So what do you see as the broader global trends accelerating the transition?
Yeah, thanks, Frank, and great to be on the panel. I think so. As the eponymous title of our webcast suggests, there are tailwinds and there are headwinds. So let's start with the positive in terms of the tailwinds, and you alluded to that early on, Frank. So significant spend we're seeing in clean tech. So depending on what organization you look at, but the IEA suggests it's about $1.8 trillion going in 2023 into clean tech. And as you suggested, significantly outstripping spend on fossil fuels. And we've seen that delta grow the last few years. So really, really positive trend there. Lots of talk about electric vehicles. You're seeing adoption of electric vehicles. So something like 1 in 5 of every car sold in the world, one is an electric vehicle. So that's a positive trend that will continue to accelerate going forward. And if you look at renewables capacity additions worldwide, 2023, something like 500 gigawatts, and you're seeing that year on year grow, driven by solar PV and onshore wind. So really, really positive story there. I guess the flip side of that, and we've seen a lot of this in the press, so a challenging business environment, so cost inflation, high interest rates, strained supply chains, and you're beginning to see some parts of those value chains within energy being adversely impacted, and clearly there's been a lot about offshore wind. Just to be clear about that, I don't think this is a structural issue across the whole of the offshore wind sector. I think this is what I would describe more as the growing pains of a nascent sector, but clearly elements of distress beginning to be seen there. But probably the biggest tailwind is, as Robert was describing, as we go into COP28, the UN came out with an update today saying that our emissions by 2030 will be up by about 9%. And we need to remember that if we're going to stay on that 1.5 degree pathway, we have to reduce global greenhouse gases by about 40% by 2030. So that clearly a challenge there. But I just want to end on a positive note on this section. I think the success we've seen to date between the partnerships between the public sector, governments, and the private sector, corporates, has been a really powerful combination. And my hope is that COP28 will hopefully manifest some of that partnership alliancing going forward to help decarbonize.
Yeah, excellent points, Adrian. And if you think about renewables in the U.S., just for an example, solar, onshore solar, well developed, almost commoditized, very affordable at this point, both overseas and domestic supply chain well established. You look at offshore wind, and the supply chain is being created as we go, right? And you've got issues like Jones Act, which are fundamental issues that the nascent industry has to overcome. So as Jennifer pointed out, some patience I think is called for as some of these emerging industries begin to develop. All right. Okay, let's go back to Jennifer. So Jennifer, we see the geopolitical situation becoming more complex by the day, and energy security is really an ongoing theme. How do you see this evolving going forward?
Well, thanks, Frank. And, as I talked about to begin with, the energy transition is affordability, it's security and availability. And so with security, we've seen just oil prices, they jumped to more than $100 a gallon, or a barrel, not a gallon, to be really bad, a barrel last year when Russia entered the Ukraine, right? They spiked again to almost $100 a barrel with the unrest in the Middle East. And we've since seen it's about at $80. However, there are concerns, right? There's concerns about the Middle East conflict and how this is going to have an effect on the economy. We've heard that some folks have likened this to the having similar effects as the 1973 oil embargo. And for those of you who don't know what that was, a little bit of a history lesson is when the Arab members of OPEC imposed an embargo against the U.S. in retaliation for support for Israel during the Arab-Israeli war. And so, again, looking at the effects in the Middle East and Russia, but then taking it to another step and looking at another super major country is China. China is import dependent on oil and natural gas, and has recognized the vulnerability and is continuing to invest in green technology to try and gain that independence. And that's what we're seeing in Europe also, right? And across the globe. So from a security standpoint, it's really looking at the availability to have standalone energy, that countries can rely on themselves. So then the geopolitical side of that, we have some significant elections happening globally in the next several years, and depending on, who is in office, that could have an effect on the pace of adoption of energy transition. I don't think it'll be necessarily that it will stop, but it could be the pace. And we saw that, when President Biden was elected, with several of his policies and policies that he implemented, but then he also overturned several things that President Trump had, as far as just the allowing the Keystone pipeline, and then weakening the fuel efficiency standards. So it's a combination, Frank, of what's happening globally with our dependence on oil and moving into that, which is accelerating into green infrastructure and independence, and then also just the pace at what that happens, depending on what the leaders are, what their agendas are. Private investment will continue to drive this, and as Robert had pointed out with COP28, we're going to see significant improvements there, and which will continue to force the conversation and force leaders across the globe to continue this transition.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. And I do agree. I think the politicians can have an impact on the trajectory of energy transition, but they're not going to stop it.
Right.
The economics are driving it at this point. Cool. So Adrian, that's a good segue. How do you see the business environment developing next year?
So good question, Frank. Just a quick build on the comments. There's fascinating comments from Jennifer. Just on that geopolitical implications, if we cast our minds back to the invasion of Ukraine, that event had triggered a series of unintended and unexpected consequences, like kind of domino effect. So you saw commodity prices go really high, so lots of inflationary pressures, cost escalation there. That triggered an energy crisis, and effectively the world's first energy crisis, a global energy crisis that dwarfed what happened that Jennifer was talking about in 1973. And that subsequently led to interest rate hikes. So you can see how this geopolitical complexity leads to consequences that affects all of us. And I do wonder sometimes, if this continues, what we're seeing in the Middle East, what will those ramifications be over the medium term? Having said that, we're in a tough business environment now, and I suspect 2024 is going to be equally as tough. So you might see some of that inflation being tamed a little bit, but you're still going to see cost inflation. You're still going to see commodity price volatility because of those factors that Jennifer alluded to, and we'll still be in a high interest rate environment. And what that means is as companies and governments deploy these low carbon projects, which tend to be by their nature capitally intensive, it's really important that companies identify those projects that are the most commercially feasible, the most bankable, because the bar to get those decisions through to final investment decision is just going to be a lot higher now. And frankly, that's a good thing. That means you get the best projects coming through the pipeline going forward. And without sounding like a broken record, again, going back to that earlier theme of partnerships between government and corporates, I think given the complexity and the difficult business environment, governments have a big role in maintaining their ambitions, not rowing back on their commitments, setting that North Star of net zero. And corporates need to be able to bring in their capital and their innovation, because those regulatory regimes that have been set up are stable, predictable, and attractive to allow that investment to flow through. If we have all those elements in place, I think we're in a good place to navigate some of that turbulence going forward.
Couldn't agree more. Robert, why don't we go to you? So what are your views on the progress that have been made in what we call ESG, resiliency, sustainability, and how do you see ESG accounting and transparency developing going forward?
Huge developments, and really building on what Adrian was just saying about the sort of business context for the energy transition, effectively being driven quite hard by a number of new climate bills and regulatory processes that have been sort of gestating during 2023 and will be at large during 2024 and 2025. And that will provide the backdrop for a much greater amount of measurement and transparency around the sustainability performance of businesses of all sizes, and whether they're public or private, around the world. So I'll just give a bit of color on that, because it's a fascinating picture. And there are a lot of acronyms, so I'll spell them out, because otherwise people just say, what? You know, too many four-letter acronyms can be a headache. So we've got the International Financial Reporting Standards. That's an important one, because that organization is harmonizing some of the larger activities that we've seen recently. So consolidating some of the reporting requirements from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, everyone knows that one now. Also consolidating the requirements from the Sustainability Standards and Accounting Board, SASB. Most of the large corporations have been reporting to that. And you've also got the International Integrated Reporting Council, IIRC, and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, all coming together, creating a unified global standard on sustainability reporting. And that's really, really important, because that sort of movement towards standardization is providing investors, risk managers, ratings agencies with a much clearer picture of how to rate the star performers versus the laggards. And I think that will be very important in terms of the financial flows, and will have a knock-on effect into that sort of quality of the energy transition that Adrian was talking to. In Europe, you've got the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, which requires climate impacts reporting, is going to require nature impacts reporting. That's coming into force in 2025. And so organizations are already getting ready for that. And of course, California jumped the gun. Everyone thought, oh, it'll be the SEC that comes out next, and everyone's been watching the SEC for their requirements on climate and greenhouse gas emissions. But actually, California jumped in with SB 253, which requires disclosures around global greenhouse gas emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3, so including the difficult one, supply chain emissions, and also SB 261, which is the disclosure on climate risk. So any company that does business in California with revenue of $500 million or more will need to make an assessment of their climate risks to their business and report on those. So what am I saying here? 2023 was actually quite a challenging year for the term ESG, and you actually don't hear that term as much as you used to, because it has now got some negative connotations, partly due to political dimensions, but also partly due to greenwashing, and so that the term losing some of its original sort of panache But that means we're actually back to talking about corporate sustainability, corporate responsibility, transparency, which is healthy. And we know that there'll be more class actions coming along, more stakeholder and shareholder motions, and indeed greenwashing actually finding its way into laws and regulations. And we saw what happened to Deutsche Bank, and I think there are many CEOs out there who will be wondering, what can we actually disclose on climate and greenhouse gas emissions? There's definitely a much more caution. So the rapid rollout of all those climate disclosures is making companies more accountable, but it's also shifting the depth and scope of reporting requirements. So it's actually forcing a shift in business strategy. And that's what good compliance actually can do. It's not just a question of ticking a box and making sure a form is filled out correctly on how much greenhouse gas emissions you've emitted. It's actually using that driver to shift the business model and the business strategy so that you're having more energy efficiency, less greenhouse gas emissions. Everyone's getting on their net zero glide path, and you're having a much more tangible shift. And so the other point I would say, Frank, about FY24 is that sustainability and responsibility are no longer sort of add-ons, they're more becoming core to business processes. So integrating social value, integrating nature, accommodating the energy transition, and of course, very important, resilience to the increasing intensity of climate impacts is front and center of many investors' worries about the effects of climate change overall. And so we're now seeing that sustainability is not a sort of a fringe business, but rather is becoming core to good procurement, good real estate management, and in our sector, of course, the infrastructure design processes around that. It's integral to our design process. It's integral to supply chain reliability and sustainability. And that links, of course, to the energy transition. So I could go on for much longer, of course. This is the heart of my area of interest and expertise, but that's some of the highlights that we're seeing coming through for FY24, Frank. So I think it'll be a very, very busy year, and a lot of organizations will be wanting some advice and some support on actually how they can make this work, how they can make sense of what some people call the alphabet soup of all these new reporting requirements and disclosures. You're on mute there, Frank.
Thank you, Robert. I was repositioning, so I had myself on mute there. Thank you. That was a good overview of a pretty complex subject. You did touch on biodiversity and nature positive just briefly. We talked about that yesterday. A little later on in the discussion, perhaps you can go a little deeper on that, because I think that's really interesting. A little off our topic, but I think interesting for our audience. So we did get a few questions in so far. Jennifer, we had one that came in the registration about small modular reactors. I had told you I was going to follow up with our Canadian colleagues, and of course I didn't. So if you want to touch on what you know, that'd be great.
Yes, yeah. So thank you, Frank. So first, for those that don't know what a small modular nuclear reactor is, it's nuclear fission reactor producing electricity with no greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a smaller and less expensive. Typically, they produce about 300 megawatts of electricity compared to about 1,200 megawatts or 7, and so that can power about 300,000 households. So just to give economy a scale of what we're talking about, the cost is usually about $1 billion per unit, as opposed to about $7 billion per unit. And what makes a small modular reactor more, I would say, considered and acceptable is that they can be factory assembled and transported and installed in industrial applications that may have limited grid capacity. And again, with zero greenhouse gas emissions. So AECOM, yes, we do have capabilities out of our Canadian team and our team within the UK as far as with design, but also then the permitting. And it is a long process to be able to get approvals. It's about a 7-year process in the US for approvals to put a small modular reactor into commission. But that being said, yes, we do have those capabilities, and our team in Canada has been supporting the nuclear power generation for, oh, I was going to say we lost Frank, for over 20 years. And so we continue to be a player in that field, but then also helping with, the development and the permitting to make sure the applications are as safe as possible. We do know that some of our clients within the US and the UK are considering this as an option for power generation, in addition to, some of the other means that we have previously discussed as they are phasing out coal fire.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Robert, I'm going to go to you next. We got just a follow-up question to Jennifer's. If you just provide maybe the European Union view on nuclear as it relates to climate change and part of the energy transition.
Sure. Well, Frank, it's a very mixed picture, and so varies very much by country specifics. So I think if we look at Germany following the Fukushima disaster, of course Germany phased out their nuclear reactors very rapidly, and of course that had the counter effect from a sort of emissions point of view of having to rely more on coal, in particular brown coal, extremely polluting version. Whereas if you take a country like France, then very significant reliance on nuclear fuel. I think up about 90% of their core grid is supplied by nuclear fuel. Whereas if you then look to the Norwegians, for example, very strong in the oil and gas industry for export, but actually most of their own power comes from their hydro plants, hydropower. So it's a very mixed picture, and I'm actually interested in Adrian's view on this as well, because you're someone who will have looked at this, Adrian. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. So I think the contextual comment first is, as we look to decarbonize, there is no silver bullet. So there's a number of technologies that are going to work together to complement one another. And clearly nuclear, I think, as Robert was alluding to, I think it's seeing a little bit of a renaissance now. There was certainly a period when it was clearly not the best flavor of the month, but I think some of the comments that Jennifer talked about, the rising importance of energy security, the need to have cleaner solutions to decarbonize, and clearly a source of base load to complement the intermittency of renewables, there's a place for nuclear there. SMRs is, as Jennifer said, I think that's a big opportunity there, particularly given that you can bring the cost down if you can scale up that technology. The growth of nuclear for the last 20 years has been broadly flat. In terms of capacity growth, it's been less than 1% year-on-year growth. But where you've seen is the majority of that capacity from the G7 countries has been gradually coming into decline as plants have been retired. China, you've seen grow significantly. But if we're going to meet our net zero commitments, the IEA is talking about we probably need to bring about another third of current capacity, an additional third by 2030 to stay on track for that 1.5 degree pathway. And there's a significant amount of additional funding that will be required. So I think broadly it's about $40 billion a year in terms of investment now. It needs to go up to about 125 billion a year going forward. So good opportunity there, still some growth required, but clearly one of the key bits of the toolkit to help us decarbonize.
Thank you, Adrian.